Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Media Connect. I am your Media Universe cartographer and the host of Streaming Media Connect 2024. Thanks for joining us. We've got a great week of programming all week, yesterday, today, tomorrow, and Thursday. There'll be a link in the chat to the agenda for the entire week. Welcome to this panel, a keynote, actually, Understanding Audiences, How Disney Advertising Leverages Data Science and Insights to Empower Advertisers. If you ever read any of the things that I write, you know that I'm keenly interested in hearing Dana McGraw, who is the SVP of Audience Modeling and Data Science at Disney, and have her talk with Nadine, who's going to be interviewing her, the contributing editor, Nadine Krefetz from Streaming Media. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. And if you're into this kind of stuff, please stick around for the whole thing. Also, if you know the music and the act who was playing that music, that was just playing as we were walking up here to the panel room, please put that into the chat. Anyone who gets both of those things right and is here by the end will be eligible to win, or actually will win. The first person who does it will win a $50 gift card from Amazon, courtesy of Streaming Media Connect. But you have to get both the song and the artist correct, and you have to be here at the end and be the first one to have said that. Also, if you stick around for 2 or more panels this week during Streaming Media Connect 2024, you're automatically entered to win an OBSpot Tail Air 4K PTZ streaming camera, which is a really cool camera. I don't know how you automatically entered, but you will be automatically entered. Also, put your questions during the Q&A and during the fireside chat in the Q&A section. Put your comments in the chat section. Look for links to bios of both of our panelists here, but also to Streaming Media NYC, which is a big event we're throwing here in New York City, May 20th through 22nd. Registration's now open. There's an early bird discount for those people who are interested in that. And also, look at the agenda. It's really jam-packed with a tremendous amount of content. We are still open for panelists for a bunch of the different panels and debates that are going on that week. All right. Without further ado, I want to introduce our host of this session, Nadine Krefetz, contributing editor to Streaming Media, for what is going to be an amazing and fascinating session. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Dana. Sorry, Evan. Dana, you. I definitely want to speak to you, and Evan will be back later. So I think one of the fascinating things here is that we're going to talk about data, audience modeling, and how things are put together for brands. So Dana, why don't you give us a little bit of background on you first, and then we can jump into a lot of these questions.
Sure. So my role, as you mentioned, is I oversee audience modeling and data science for Disney advertising, so specific to the advertising business at Disney. And that group entails the obvious, a group of data scientists, but also some advanced analytics experts. And we also have a group of people who are responsible for attribution, and so enabling measurement and attribution across campaigns that run with us. And then some more consumer type researchers that are looking at kind of thought leadership pieces in the industry, whether it be around streaming or other sort of entities that we touch, and they're conducting that type of consumer research as well.
Okay. I think this is fascinating because I think it's not often that we get to really get an insight into a lot of the data that companies are acquiring and then, having used to better kind of suit our advertising that we get to see. But so, you're looking at streamers and you're getting a sense of who's watching. In fact, I think I heard you mention 2,000 different audience segments. So first, why don't we go into what is it that you actually are looking at when you go and look at the behavior of a streamer? What's involved in that?
Sure. So it's interesting coming at it from the advertising perspective, right? So as a publisher, that we're specifically looking at data that helps us enable targeted advertising. So right ad, right place, right time within our streaming businesses and across all of our inventory. So we're really looking at those kind of psychographic and behavioral pieces of data that allow us to create those kind of segments. So 2,000 segments seems extreme, in terms of what you would need for advertising targeting. But if you think about all the different advertisers and categories and needs and key performance indicators across those groups, then you start to chip away and understand why there's all of these different segments that serve a different purpose. So we're sort of inheriting the data that allows us to then, and often, many cases, to model these segments across the entire audience, but it's hundreds of thousands of different attributes that are coming through that we're looking at specifically for the advertising business to create those segments. So it started out small, and we talked about this a little when we were preparing before. So it started a long time ago and started very small. And then over time, as we started to see how things perform, what works, what doesn't work, we've sort of grown and added segments and added different little nuance to the way that we're sort of conducting business and the way that we're thinking about data. And it's grown to those 2,000 segments, which could be anything like, the chief decision maker in a household for consumer packaged good products, or it could be, a particular, potentially in the market to switch cell service providers. So it runs the gamut within those segments. But again, there's hundreds of thousands of attributes that are contributing to how we build those segments.
Okay. And that's, of course, one of the modern miracles that is digital, that you can do all that kind of data acquisition and data modeling. You mentioned, in fact, a couple of the really interesting titles. What were some of the, to me, more quirky groupings of viewers that you consider?
Yeah, I think the thing that I always find, it's a social experiment, right? And so you start to understand human behaviors and how things group together. And so it's really interesting to look at things like, we've used this example a lot, but if we, ESPN is within our purview. So we're looking at sports fans, and we have NHL fans, for instance. And we know things like they over-index for being in the market for SUVs, or being willing to switch their, cell phone provider, or drinking domestic beer. So it's like you start to learn all of these things about groupings of fans and groupings of people. But we also look at things like, well, an NHL fan on ESPN also consumes this kind of content on Hulu, or, this kind of content on Disney Plus. So you start to understand across really different parts of the life of a consumer, and sort of in different stages of being, what they're consuming and what they're interested in, and sort of what they're predisposed to over-index for. And so that's the really interesting stuff, is things like that start to come out, and you're like, I wouldn't have thought this group of people who, in the aggregate index for this kind of genre of shows on Hulu are also boxing fans. And so it's things like that start to get really, really interesting and come to life for us. And it's interesting, I think, for advertisers as well, because you start to think about where you would typically place your buy for the kind of consumer that is of high value to you. And we start to see all of these different places where they're actually interacting.
Okay. So just to give anybody in the audience who's not as familiar with how advertising is bought and sold. So a brand comes to you. What happens when they start talking data or start talking audience?
Yeah, it depends on the brand and the level of kind of sophistication with data, or the level of access to data they might have on their own. But definitely we start talking about, what do you want to accomplish? And so we could be talking with the brand directly, we could be speaking with their agency, and we start thinking about a particular campaign, or for us, a buy. We might refer, their campaign is a buy to us. And so what do you want to accomplish? Are you trying to drive, visits to a website? Are you trying to drive app installs? Are you trying to get someone into your quick service restaurant? Sort of what are you looking to accomplish? And then we start thinking through, okay, how do you define an audience that's of significant value to you? What characteristics belong in that group? And then we start to think through, like, okay, well, these are the kind of segments we have. This is where we see, that group of people consuming content from us. So here's where you would start to think about where you would want to buy inventory for us to reach those specific people.
Okay. And are they doing this in an automated fashion, or are they doing this with a direct person?
It's both, really. And the automated piece has really grown. So we've been pushing into wanting to do 40-50% of our business. We're in that direction in terms of what's automated or addressable for our advertising business. So, and that's growing year over year all of the time in terms of how that works. There's still, obviously, there's some buys that are not as automated, that are not as addressable. But again, as streaming grows, that percentage starts to change. But just because something is automated or addressable doesn't mean there isn't a conversation. Okay. So there could still be a great deal of consultation and conversation around what are we trying to accomplish together and how do we enable that for you. And that's where that conversation about data and what is your key performance indicator, what does your ideal audience look like, and how do we help you, those conversations can still happen on an addressable buy. It's just the ultimate buying mechanism is what changes.
Okay. And when you say addressable, let's just define this for people. What does addressable mean?
Essentially, the easiest way to put it is targetable. So okay. there's a way to buy a very specific audience in a targeted way. Okay,
great. Now, I know one of the things that we previously talked about was, to my mind, a long time ago, or at least a few years ago, the idea that everybody had a data scientist on staff was something that was really an anomaly. It wasn't something that people could afford to do. But how are brands kind of working with this requirement now? Does everybody now have a data scientist, or are they more counting on you to actually bring the intelligence?
There's a little of both. I think even if you think about, smaller brands or, smaller companies that maybe don't have access to as much data, they have someone that's in a role. It may not be a data science per se with, a master's or a PhD in some kind of engineering or neuroscience or some such, but they have someone that's in an analytics role. I think really to a person, to a company, there's someone that's in that analytics role. The size of that group and the sophistication given the data that they have varies, but I really don't think there's many brands, if any, now that are moving forward with trying to run an advertising business or trying to run a business for that matter without at least someone in an analytics function for them.
Okay. All right. I'm going to get back to a little bit later about what we do with that. But first, so your title is Audience Modeling and Data Science. What are the differences there between those two terms?
Probably not as much as there was when the title first came to be, right? So I think really it's around how do we model and understand our audiences, and the data science piece is how do we leverage the real science and not just kind of aggregating, data without the science and the machine learning and the algorithms behind it. So we sort of distinguish advanced analytics from data science in a data scientist is probably writing algorithms. They're using a significant amount of machine learning for modeling, whereas an analyst is taking the data that is available and sort of gleaning insights and doing, a high level of math and work on that data, but they're not necessarily writing algorithms. So that's sort of how you would distinguish. Audience modeling can be done potentially without writing algorithms and machine learning and that level of code, whereas data science really involves all of that. Okay.
So a brand now will have an idea as to what or whom they want to reach. They then also have some of this data about who they want to reach or what kind of their buyer intent is. So what happens when they have data and you have data? What do you do with it?
Yeah, well, it's evolved, right? I think if you would have asked me a couple of years ago, the answer would be there's some intermediary that's some kind of a third-party data onboarding service potentially. And the brand would want to onboard their data through that third-party service, and then we would subsequently reach that audience once that information reached to us. I think given deprecation of cookies, changes in privacy policies overall, all of those kinds of things, that has really evolved. And sort of 2 years ago, I believe, a little over, we started working in clean rooms. So that model has evolved into a clean room model in which data is not exchanging hands. And so we're able to collaborate, we're able to sort of help one another, to glean insights from one another, but the data is not moving. So it's a greater privacy protection for the consumer, for us, but we're still able to accomplish the same thing. So there's really this notion of we want to understand overlapping audiences, and we also want to understand gaps. And so it's that data collaboration that's now largely happening in clean room spaces that's allowing us to do that. And then that sort of consultation I referenced before really evolves into, okay, here's what we see, here's what we now understand, understanding your sort of audiences of significant high value to you, here's what we know about them, here's the insights we can deliver, and here's where you can reach them in our inventory.
Okay. And so this, the use of clean rooms, previously this wasn't the case, or was it more of a, I think the term that I remember was privacy sandbox. How, like, what's the
that's
difference
something,
really
yeah,
now?
that was pretty specific to Google. But yeah, so if you think about, there's been plenty of data onboarding companies, right? So LiveRamp being one, there's been many. And so that's really originally how all of this sort of collaboration came to be. And even that was relatively new, right? So 2 years ago, we started working in a clean room and have built out a pretty robust clean room. Before that, it was onboarding services. Before that, it was kind of talking to each other and explaining things, right? So it's really evolved relatively quickly in terms of what the data space looks like. And it's always evolving. So, you know, how we think about things and how we make it even better, it's evolving so quickly. We laugh internally, is, you know, there's 5-year plans and long range plans, and in the data space you can make one, but in reality it's probably going to change within 6 months what your plans are and what direction you're going, because just the entire industry is moving so quickly.
Okay. And again, another thing we did talk about before was people who collect data, do they have too much, too little? What's their take on this?
Yeah, so I will give you my perspective, and I think our perspective is, you don't need to collect all of the data. You need to think about what you need to do, not what you can do, and have sort of the North Star being, what does the consumer expect from us? And so I think when you approach it that way, if you are innovative about it, there is plenty you can do without going too far. And so really just having your North Star being, not what am I allowed to do, but what is the consumer's expectation of us as the Walt Disney Company? And so if that's first and foremost, we really try to collect the minimum amount of data for us, particularly in the advertising business, that we need.
Okay. You know, and I think of a number of companies that I know of who, you know, the idea is that they've collected the data, they don't know what to do with it now because they have too much of it. But realistically, one of the things I want to ask you about is, do people look at their data and say, I need this very specific model, and, you know, how can you help me there? Or I need to know how I would target something in terms of what off-the-shelf types of targeting you have?
Yeah, there's some of both. There's some amount of, so I'll give an example. So if let's say we're engaged with the brand in the clean room, and we're able to run an overlap, and we say, wow, that, you know, the audience that you're interested in and our audience have X% overlap, which is significantly high. We can say, you know what, we have this off-the-shelf audience segment we've already built, and it maps to 90% of your need. Let's just use that. It's quick. We can move on. There's other cases when there's maybe a more sophisticated need or a more nuanced need, and we could do lookalike modeling within our clean room environment to grow that audience and to increase the scale. And then there's other cases where none of that happens. There's no clean room match. There's just that, hey, we happen to know that, you know, your segment for a Disney Best Guest, for instance, is something that is a group of people that we would like to reach for this particular campaign. Can we just use that segment? So it really runs the gamut, and it could run the gamut within a brand, depending on the campaign, depending on sort of the KPI and what they're trying to do with that campaign. So that's sort of why we try to offer this breadth of options around. It can be very sophisticated. We can do some additional modeling and lookalike modeling and optimization there, or it can just be an off-the-shelf segment and go right away, get the campaign up and running. And then obviously the brands and the agencies are looking at those results and then trying to optimize from there.
Okay. Disney Select. What is Disney Select?
So Disney Select is really our sort of suite of data offerings. So if you think about those 2,000 audience segments, that's Disney Select. Okay. I would add to Disney Select all of those capabilities I just mentioned around lookalike modeling and all of those things. It's sort of our suite of data offerings.
Okay. And again, automated and direct buys essentially are available.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. So let's see, why don't we look at co-viewing. Co-viewing is something that whenever I am around people who are in the advertising space, this always comes up and it's always an issue. So you just did some research on this. Can you just fill us in a bit on what it is and why it's important?
Yeah, it's obviously very important to us if you think about just our company in general, right? And you think about the kind of content that we bring to bear. Co-viewing is a big deal for us. And so I mentioned that there's a part of my team that does consumer research. And so for years, every year they've done a bit of research. We call it Generation Stream. And so each one has had a little different flavor, but it's really looking at macro level streaming behaviors, how people are consuming content. And then getting down to, we're doing ethnographies, we're doing all of these things to even get down to a little bit more of a micro level of what it all means. So the most recent one is Generation Stream Family Edition. And we really looked at that piece, that co-viewing piece around a family. And not just, some traditional definition of a family, but just in general, the family of people that you consume content with. And it's just interesting to start to see how those things break out. So there's, we group them into, interesting little names like ritual relaxers and selfie escapists, but it's how you're consuming content. And then we're able to sort of look at that behavior and that co-viewing or the behavior of how you consume content on your own versus how you consume it with others and on and on. And then we're able to take those segments and pull them into Disney Select ultimately and offer them as a buy. So you can, buy against this group or segment that's viewing in this particular way. But that co-viewing piece is really important, particularly in the advertising business, right? Because you haven't just served the ad to one person in the home. If co-viewing is happening, you've served it to 2 or to 3.
Okay, so you've got this kind of a Venn diagram of the viewers in the household and the interest you want to reach that everybody, or at least many of them in the household have.
That's exactly right.
Is this something that you couldn't have done before without machine learning and data science? I mean, would it have been much harder?
Yeah, definitely. Well, and without streaming, right? So if you think about devices and streaming and how all of these things map together, and so we talk about it, and we had a tech and data showcase at CES this year, and we talked a little bit about advancement with neural networks, and so what that means for us. And if you just think about in your head whether you know what a neural network is or not, you can start to see the bubbles and how things interconnect. And so that's really how we're thinking about it. And so with streaming and devices and mobile and all of those things, that starts to come together in ways that it just wasn't available before.
Okay, so I like to think of the fact that streaming has brought deep intelligence into this industry. Okay, why don't we move on to how performance is measured? Because we also talked about this and there being some issues around that. Can you kind of give me an overview on the topic?
Yeah, so it's interesting, I guess, flip side of what we were discussing in the clean room around targeting. The flip side of that is measurement. And so you need to know how it performed in order to optimize or to know, which segments work the best, et cetera. So we built our own, speaking of kind of neural networks, we built our own audience graph. So we have a proprietary Disney audience graph that we built for this specific purpose. So it is the underpinning and the backbone of all of those audience segments of, all of that work that we're thinking about around, how do you map a household and how do you think about that in the aggregate? Well, the same audience graph needs to fuel measurement. So particularly in the streaming and the CTV space, measurement has been very hard. And it always is, right? With something new, and how do you think about it? But the way that, devices work is very fragmented because all of the different offerings for how you stream, not just whether it's Disney Plus or Hulu, but what device you're using to enable that. And so measurement has had to kind of catch up in the streaming space in terms of accuracy. So we're enabling measurement using our audience graph. And we talked about this, and I know everyone is not of an advertising background in this group. So we talked a little bit about interoperability. And so really taking our proprietary audience graph in a super privacy focused way and becoming interoperable with other audience graphs from measurement companies, et cetera, to ensure that the measurement is accurate. So we're creating that linkage to allow for the accurate measurement, particularly in the streaming space. It's been a little bit easier, I think, mobile prior to streaming, but then how do you link those two things together? If you think about typical advertising metrics like reach and frequency, how do you manage that across multiple devices? And how do you think about measuring accurately across all of that?
Okay. And so realistically, the measurement issues that come up are because of the diversity of delivery mechanisms and also I would say vendors in this space. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, it's the relative newness, right? The diversity of identifiers, for lack of a better word, and different measurement vendors use different identity spines or audience graphs to reconcile those things. And so that interoperability piece becomes so important, so that you're kind of creating apples to apples, independent of how someone is resolving identity.
Okay. And I know one of the things you mentioned in Vegas at the tech event was working with Amazon and Google. So what is happening there? Yeah.
So that is a part of our programmatic business, and also a part of our clean room business. So if you think about there's many DSPs, and so we've talked about historically we want to be agnostic to DSPs for programmatic, but in this particular case at the Tech and Data Showcase, what we're really talking about is in clean room spaces. So if you think about, we've historically, the first clean room that we offered was sitting on Snowflake as a backend, and so not everyone is using Snowflake as a backend, many are, but we want to be able to make ourselves available in a clean room, no matter where the brand wants to be or the agency wants to be. Same is true of measurement, right? We want to make ourselves interoperable with whatever measurement vendor is your vendor of choice. So we want to be kind of agnostic to cloud environments. So really that is about what clean room are we in? How do we make ourselves more available to brands and being available where everyone is?
Okay. And of course, that's definitely the ultimate goal. But I guess, again, when we talked about the different platforms and different ways that you're delivering, so is there a noticeable difference between the data that's collected on digital versus a CTV environment, for instance?
It's different in terms of identifiers for sure, but ultimately in terms of the way, if it's digital streaming, like the identifier is different, but ultimately the data is essentially the same if you've structured it correctly from sort of how you collect first party data.
Okay. And I know a long time ago, there used to be all sorts of kind of information around about first, second, third party data. People don't really use second party data that much, but when you're talking to your the brands who are buying from you, do they still talk about first, second, and third party data, or there's different terminology that's now used?
No, definitely. It's interesting because our data is first party data to us, right? But brand A's data is first party data to them. So that there's that conversation. Their data is second party to us, ours is second party to them, et cetera. So definitely there's still that terminology. But it's obviously confusing based on what I just described, right? In terms of, wait, who's first party? But if you think about the data you collect on your own platforms, that's your first party data. Third party data is generally speaking from a third-party company that maybe is not the original data owner, but is in the market of kind of selling data or brokering data.
Okay. The other things, and we don't have a ton of time left, but the other things I was thinking about was there's different advertising products that you have. Are they using different? For instance, you have an e-commerce thing, I think, that you just announced recently. Is data used differently when it comes to targeting on the e-commerce side versus just a regular kind of 15 or 30-second ad?
Differently in that you would potentially be reaching different audiences, right? So it's ultimately the same data for, and the same audience graph that we've built that we're using to enable all of these things, but who you are intending to reach is what would be different in those cases.
Okay. All right. Okay, we have this huge world of data now that exists now that didn't previously exist. I think one of the things I think about is, has this changed the upfronts? You have a different kind of mentality going into things, don't you?
Well, lucky for me, I'm the data person, so only peripherally involved in those
Well,
conversations.
meaning
Yeah.
not necessarily the mechanics, but how
Yeah.
has it changed the upfronts in terms of the way people think about data?
Yeah,
Within
definitely.
the scope of what you do.
The degree to which, we're asked questions and we're asked about our data capabilities in those conversations has changed dramatically in the last few years. So again, those 2,000 audience segments, what does it include? What can you bring to bear? Are you able to do this kind of thing? Are you able to enable this type of measurement? Those questions now come up in conversations in ways they never did historically. So the ability, it's part of why we have a tech and data showcase each year now, right? And we're at CES this year, is because those data capabilities, that level of innovation is a huge part of what people want to know when they're considering the upfronts.
Okay. And again, you also announced at the event in Vegas, the consolidation of Hulu and Disney Plus data. So how does that work? Are you able to target further than you were before?
Yeah, so it's really the addition of Disney Plus to all of our capabilities. And again, I think we talked about at the showcase as well, rolling that out globally. So as Disney Plus rolls out globally, trying to have parity in our data offerings, based on each market and each market's requirements, but having that across the world as we roll out Disney Plus. So that idea, I mentioned about being able to think about a fan of certain kinds of content across all of our platforms, whether it's Disney Plus, Hulu, ESPN, it's that coming together. That's really exciting for us because we're just sort of able to understand on a greater scale.
Okay, so we've now gone from, I guess the targeting previously used to be on age, gender, maybe a demographic, to, is it hundreds, thousands, millions of pieces of data? How is it kind of classified?
Yeah, and that's why we try to break it down into those 2,000 segments, because if you think about the possibilities, if hundreds of thousands of attributes are coming in and all of the different machinations of those attributes, you could get into the, hundreds of thousands of segments in theory. But we try to think about the most meaningful segments of audiences at scale. Because if you create an audience segment, but it's going to serve impressions that in the low 100s, then it's not doing any good because you haven't reached the scale that you need. So we really try and think about, we have all of these attributes, we have all of these kind of behavioral understandings, but at scale. So thinking about cohorts in aggregate so that we have enough scale to deliver a campaign.
Okay. We have practically no time left. Is there anything else you want to add just as we wrap up?
No, I mean, I think just hopefully you can sense how excited I am about, the streaming space. And you're right, what it's brought to bear for us, as data professionals and the kind of intelligence and the kind of innovation that we're able to do because of the growth of streaming. So I think, it's only going to get more exciting and we're looking forward to continuing to innovate.
Okay. And so ideally that should mean better advertising experiences for consumers, which is
absolutely, that's the goal.
Really,
you're absolutely right. Yep,
we
that's all a part of thinking about what does a consumer want from us. That's absolutely right.
Perfect. All right, we will check back in with you again in the future on this and have another conversation. Thank you very much, Dana, and I will hand this back to Steve.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dana. Thanks, Nadine. I know y'all are calling in from the West Coast and a lot of storms going on there and everything, so I really appreciate that you could make it today. And also know you had a hard stop at 9:05, Dana. So it's great that you could spend this time with us. This has been fantastic. Let's see, as we wrap up here, we do want to announce our gift card winner. The walk-up music for this was great hardbop jazz trumpeter Freddie Hubbard with Ariadis and Matthew LeCount guessed it first, or named it first. So thanks, Matthew. So join us back here at 1 o'clock Eastern time for low latency, high stakes, delivering real-time streams at scale. It's going to be a great session. So thanks, Nadine and Dana, and hopefully we'll see you later today.
Perfect.